Hi, it's time for another mini Bible study on the stories of King David. So after David defeats Goliath, and David is still a boy at this point, he's not allowed to return to caring for his father's sheep. Instead, he remains in King Saul's court, where he encounters the best of friends and the worst of enemies. 1 Samuel chapter 18 goes like this. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul sent him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. And the women sang to one another as they made merry, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So David is the new hero of Israel. You might say men want to be like him, and women want to be with him. Everybody loves David, except for Saul, that is. Saul is jealous and fearful. He's overcome by evil spirits and maybe mentally ill. He's very unpredictable at this point. But David has this special relationship with Jonathan. So who is this Jonathan? To find that out, we have to go back to 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 14, before David is anointed by Samuel. Jonathan is introduced as a commander of 1,000, the full third of Saul's army. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And Jonathan defeats a garrison of Philistines at Geba, which starts a rebellion against the Philistines. And the Philistines muster against Israel, respond to Jonathan's victory by mustering against Israel, and the Philistine army massively outnumbers the Israelites. But to respond, Saul loses the element of surprise because he's waiting for Samuel to come and do the sacrifices before they attack. And so it goes really badly. Most of Saul's army deserts and only 600 people remain. Then the next chapter, this war with the Philistines continues, and it says, one day, Jonathan, son of Saul, that is, Jonathan is the crown prince. Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. But he did not tell his father. So Jonathan is the prince, his father is Saul, and he defies his father, the king, to go out and attack a Philistine garrison with only his armor bearer. And Jonathan pulls it off. The two of them, and they must have been in a tight place, single combat, and they kill 20 Philistines between them. And the rest of chapter 14 is really neat. It's a great story to see more of the Saul-Jonathan father-son relationship. But I want to focus on Jonathan's relationship with David today. So what's important to know from that is that Jonathan is the crown prince and the hero of the day, but he openly defies his father. He provokes Saul into action. That's twice that Jonathan attacks and Saul has to follow. And Jonathan has the people's support. But because of Saul's actions, Samuel has declared that Saul's descendants won't inherit the throne. There will be a new king and a new line instead of Saul's line. So fast forward back to David and Goliath, and as soon as David defeats Goliath and is introduced to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. So earlier, when Samuel was rejecting Saul as king, he had linked Saul's robe with Saul's kingship. So when Jonathan does this, he's probably unconsciously passing the kingship to David by giving him his royal robe. And David accepts the robe as well as Jonathan's armor and his sword and bow and belt. Which is interesting because earlier, before David went out to face Goliath, he put on Saul's armor and it didn't fit, so he returned it. But now he accepts the gift of Jonathan's armor. Jonathan, who prior to this was the hero of Israel, and now it's David. So meanwhile, Saul fears David and wants him dead. Twice. All right, so Saul tries to kill David himself with his spear, and he tries to have David killed in battle with the Philistines. He keeps sending David out to fight the Philistines, and David comes back victorious and even more popular. So finally, Saul speaks to Jonathan and all his servants about killing David. This is the beginning of chapter 19. And Jonathan, who has never been afraid to speak up to his father, speaks up in favor of David. And Saul is convinced. He relents this time, and David continues as he has in Saul's court. And then there's another war with the Philistines, and David wins again. And again, an evil spirit comes upon Saul. And again, Saul tries to spear David. And David flees and goes home. And this time Saul sends assassins to David's house. And David's wife, Saul's daughter Michal, helps David to escape. And David flees to the prophet Samuel. And Saul follows him but fails to capture David. So then in chapter 20, David speaks to Jonathan, and he's speaking formally as a courtier to a prince. And Jonathan can't believe that his father would try to kill David behind his back. So the two of them make a plan to determine Saul's intention toward David. So David hides outside Saul's city. And Jonathan speaks to Saul about David. And this time, when Jonathan speaks to Saul about David, Saul throws his spear at his own son, at Jonathan. And Jonathan finally gets it, how much Saul fears and hates David. So the next day, Jonathan goes out to David, and as soon as the two of them are alone, this is reading from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 41 and 42. David rose from beside the stone heap and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. And David wept the more. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, since both of us have sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord shall be between both of us, shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" He got up and left, and Jonathan went into the city. And so they go their separate ways. David a political fugitive, and Jonathan back to his father's court. They meet one last time in chapter 23, verse 16. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh when he learned that Saul had come out to seek his life. And before Saul can find him, Saul's son Jonathan set out and came to David at Horesh. There he strengthened his hand through the Lord, and he said to him, "Do not be afraid, for the hand of my father Saul shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be second to you. And my father Saul also knows that this is so." Then the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. And so to the very end, Jonathan hopes that somehow they can be together, living together in peace, ruling side by side. But they never meet again. At the end of 1 Samuel, Jonathan and his brothers are killed by the Philistines in battle, while David is fighting a separate battle against the Amalekites. And Saul sees his sons die and also dies that day. And when David is told, he laments. The first chapter of 2 Samuel. "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of woman." So that's Jonathan. And there's been a lot made of the nature of David and Jonathan's relationship. It was certainly covenantal. They promised to be loyal and faithful to one another and to each other's children many times. People wonder if it was a platonic relationship or romantic, and I guess, my opinion, everyone is said to love David, everyone except for Saul. But they have this great loyalty to one another. And David expresses his emotions toward Jonathan more than he expresses, which is really rare for David, as he's usually very political, doesn't show his cards. But when he's saying goodbye to Jonathan, it's him who cries the longest in chapter 20. And he gives it all away in the first chapter of 2 Samuel, saying, "Greatly beloved you were to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of woman." And he says, "I am distressed for you." He calls him his brother.